Imagine being 18, your hair braided and scented with saffron, a veil of fine wool pinned across your forehead while the city sings. Imagine a procession, neighbors throwing walnuts, servants bearing torches, a father's arm heavy with relief, all of it public, bright, performative. Imagine then that the same evening, behind a closed door, strangers wait to decide whether your marriage exists in law. Discover the sinister wedding night custom hidden by ancient Rome, a practice that turned an intimate threshold into public evidence, a private body into legal proof. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe and stay with this story. There is more to unearth. The daytime wedding in Rome could look radiant. Women braided hair with saffron, a flame-colored veil called the flammeum shaded the bride's face, and songs and processions marked the transfer of a daughter from her natal household to her husband's. From the outside, these rites were theatrical celebrations of alliance and reciprocity. Inside them, however, lay a different logic, a legal system that treated marriage as a transfer of authority, property, and future heirs. For many Roman families, the moment that truly mattered was not the song nor the feast, but the moment when the household, through witnesses, ritual, and sometimes medical procedure, could claim proof that the union had been consummated and that the bride entered the household with the status expected of a wife. To follow this story, meet a fictional composite created to carry the historical fragments into human focus, Livia Tirsa. Livia is not a documented individual. She is an illustrative figure assembled from the social patterns, legal texts, and stray references that survive. She has a husband in the record of our reconstruction, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a man of some wealth who trades grain and commands a household of clients and slaves. She arrives at his domus amid celebration, and we will reconstruct, carefully labeled as reconstruction, what might have happened when the crowd dispersed and a closed, ritualized procedure began. It is essential at the outset to situate the ritual within Roman legal thought. Roman marriage, particularly under the regime of Manus, involved the bride's transfer from her father's legal authority into her husband's. Even where Manus was absent and a woman remained legally tied to her natal family, marriage still created obligations and expectations about property, dowry, and progeny. Legitimate children mattered. They were the heirs who would inherit property, carry the family name, and secure political alliances. For Romans, proof mattered. The legal culture prized witnesses, written records, and demonstrable acts. When the question of an heir's legitimacy arose, whether in disputes over inheritance or in accusations of adultery, fact-based evidence or testimony could become decisive.
Into this legal matrix entered a set of practices intended to convert the intimate facts of sex and virginity into social and juridical facts. Sources are fragmentary. They are not a straightforward manual. What survives are scattered references, rhetorical condemnations by Christian writers who found the practice odious, passing mentions from pagan authors, legal commentaries that assume verification had a role in certain situations, and medical writers who described examinations, sometimes clinical in tone. From these shards, modern scholars have pieced together a plausible, if contested, reconstruction, that in some marriages, on the wedding night, a ritual act was performed in front of witnesses, that an emblem, often identified as a wooden phallic object associated with the household deity Mutinus Tutinus, played a role, that a prunuba, a matronal attendant, supervised acts that were meant to register consummation, and that in some extreme cases a physician or midwife examined the bride to provide testimony of virginity or of recent coitus. Scholars emphasize variability and caution. Not every Roman bride experienced this, and the precise forms of these practices changed over time and place. Still, the evidence points to a practice that converted intimate events into evidence for legal ends. We begin with the public image of Livia's wedding because the contrast is crucial. Picture the ritual scene. The bride's garments are bright with dye. The flammeum colors her face a dim burnished orange. Her friends braid her hair and fasten amulets for protection. The ritual vocabulary is saturated with fertility imagery, nuts thrown underfoot to assure fecundity, songs that call for vigorous health in many children. The procession is headed to the groom's house, loudly claiming the couple's new status in the sight of the neighborhood. That spectacle says to every passerby, this union is legitimate, the families are allied. What the spectacle hides is the legal work that must follow. For a family like the Petronii, property is at stake. The grain storehouse must pass eventually to legitimate heirs. Client-patron relationships must be preserved through unambiguous succession. In Rome, testimony and witnessing were the devices that anchored social claims. The presence of witnesses on the wedding night, then, is not a mere superstition. It is an enactment of the legal culture. To register the consummation, the act that makes a union reproductively productive, happened. This is not a simple moral story about fidelity. It is a procedural, bureaucratic logic applied to the threshold of a private bedroom. Let us move carefully into the night. The procession reaches the groom's atrium. Torches gutter in the cold lamplight. Slaves close the doors. A few relatives remain at the threshold. Inside, the prunava, a respected matron who carries the ritual functions of escorting brides to marriage, plays a new role.
In life and in law, she is a guarantor, socially competent, responsible for ensuring that the rites are done correctly. On many nights, her role would have been celebratory and protective. On other nights, as the sources imply, she oversaw a ritualized verification. In the corner, under linen, sits a wooden figure, sometimes described by later writers as phallic, sometimes as a rudimentary emblem, associated by name with mutinus tutinus, a deity linked to sexual potency. The presence of that object in the household is not merely decorative. Its symbolic function transforms a private act into a performative, demonstrative action within the family's communal life. What did the act look like? Here we move from the safer terrain of legal analysis into a dramatized reconstruction rooted in the evidence fragment. The following scene is a reconstruction. It draws on descriptions and inferences found across the surviving texts and material culture, shaped to convey the emotional tenor of the event. It should be read as an informed imagining, not as a transcript. Livia stands in the dim room. The veil is still pinned on, though it has been shifted for the evening. The pronaba, older and steady-handed, offers a hand that is at once supportive and directive. Marcus's household stands in the periphery, a few relatives, an attendant or two, perhaps a physician called in for the purpose. Someone removes the linen covering the wooden emblem. It seems small and raw, carved in haste or age. The pronaba instructs Livia to perform a gesture onto the emblem, in some accounts described as sitting or mounting the object, a gesture that mimics intercourse in symbolic form. The action is not about pleasure or intimacy, but about representation, to make in visible form the fact that sexual union has been enacted. If such a gesture was followed by a medical examination, it was for the same juridical end, to produce a physical record. Medical writers of antiquity sometimes discuss the signs of virginity and recent intercourse in detached terms. Legal commentators assume that the testimony of a physician or midwife could resolve disputes. The physician's examination, details of which are debated, might be limited to observation of the state of the hymen or other bodily signs. In some narrated cases, evidence of bleeding or of recent penetration was taken as proof. In others, the absence of such signs produced accusations of prior defloration and the dispute moved into courts. The physician's role in the construction of legal fact was to translate bodily ambiguity into social certainty. The witnesses in the household, meanwhile, stood at the threshold. Their memory and testimony could be summoned later as legal evidence. This procedure was not merely theatrical humiliation. Its very normalcy, its institutionalization, made it sinister in the particular way it enclosed women within a legal architecture that commodified their bodies in service of property and succession. For the bride, the experience could be traumatic. The compulsory display or examination, the presence of witnesses, the knowledge that one's body would be turned into proof. For the family of the groom, it was a necessary safeguard against fraudulent claims. For the society, it was a way of making the invisible visible, of aligning intimate life with civic order. But how do we know this? Here the historian must be candid about sources and gaps. Our picture is assembled from a range of fragmentary materials. Christian authors such as Augustine, Arnobius, and Lactantius wrote denunciations in which they describe certain sexual customs with moral outrage. Their tone is condemnatory, often intended to contrast Christian purity with pagan corruption, and that influences how we interpret their references. Pagan authors like Varro mention cult practices and domestic rites in more neutral terms, occasionally referring to household deities and customs. Legal texts offer the framework about manus, about witnesses, about the importance of jenkin. Medical treatises supply anatomical and clinical language, discussing the body in ways that can be read as relevant to verification practices. Archaeological finds, domestic shrines, small carved figures, phallic amulets show that phallic symbolism was part of domestic religiosity. Yet none of these sources presents a comprehensive manual for an all-encompassing wedding night ritual. Instead, historians assemble a mosaic, sometimes suggested tiles, sometimes missing patches. Because the sources are uneven, scholars debate the degree to which the practices were ritualized, how widespread they were, and whether they were standardized across social classes and regions. Some argue that ritualized symbolic acts, a bride's symbolic seating or a pronibus supervision, were more common among the elite as a way of publicly confirming social obligations. Others suggest that more invasive medical procedures may have occurred in contested cases, especially among the elite where property stakes were high. Still others see a spectrum of practices, from symbolic gestures that registered continuity with fertility cults to formal examinations used by courts in litigation. The evidence resists a single narrative.
Christian writers played a role in preserving fragments of this story, though not in the way earlier sensational accounts sometimes claim. They didn't invent the ritual. Rather, in their polemical writings, they condemned and catalogued what they perceived as pagan licentiousness. Augustine, writing in a Christianized Roman world, refers with moral opprobrium to sexual customs and to practices that he sees as idolatrous or abusive.
Arnobius and Lactantius use such examples to argue for the superiority of Christian moral disciplines. Their denunciations served a rhetorical purpose, to define Christianity against a contested pagan past. Because their writings were copied, quoted, and circulated within the Christian literary tradition, they preserved references to certain practices that otherwise might have faded. At the same time, the Christian moral lens complicates our understanding. When a practice appears only in the polemical catalogues of enemies, historians must weigh the probability of exaggeration and the lack of neutral confirmation. Archaeology contributes, but with limits. Household shrines and phallic imagery, including statuettes and graffiti, attest to the everyday presence of sexual symbolism in domestic life. Yet translating those objects into ritual practice requires caution. A carved phallus found in a house does not on its own demonstrate that the household used it in a legal verification ritual on wedding nights. Still, the objects show that households contain symbolic language that could be mobilized in ceremonies intended to secure fertility and potency. The specific association of a wooden phallic emblem with mutinus tutinus, invoked in some late sources, provides a connecting thread, but it is not a thorough proof. Importantly, the historiography shows that the ritual's visibility shifted with cultural transformation. As Christianity spread and became the empire's dominant religion, some features of pagan practice were actively contested, suppressed, or transformed. Statues associated with certain rites were desecrated, shrines were dismantled, and legal and moral discourse changed. This was not an overnight erasure, but a complex, uneven process. Some families clung to older customs, others adapted them. Many rituals were reinterpreted in new theological contexts. The act of remembering or forgetting was itself political. What was preserved in texts after the Christianization of the empire often reflects what later authors found worth condemning or reforming, leaving other practices unrecorded by the surviving corpus. Thus, the hidden dimension in our title has two senses. First, the practice was physically concealed, moved behind doors, enshrouded in ritual language, performed in the company of household witnesses rather than in public. Second, over centuries, it was hidden for modern view, references scattered among polemics, ruins of domestic shrines misinterpreted, and the voices of the women who might have experienced the rite erased. The erasure was both deliberate and incidental. Christian writers condemned and sometimes called for the destruction of what they found abhorrent. Later copying priorities of medieval scribes privileged theological and legal works over household manuals, and the bodies most central to these customs, women, seldom left written testimony that might correct or nuance the image preserved by men.
What did this mean for brides like our composite Livia? The consequences were complex. If the ritual functioned as intended, it might secure a woman's place as a legally recognized wife, protect her children's claims, and safeguard the familial alliance. It could also subject her to humiliation, exposure, and the medicalization of her body. The pronaba's authority could be protective in form, yet coercive in practice. A matron who guided the bride could also enforce a public performance that magnified the bride's vulnerability. If the verification failed, if witnesses reported a lack of signs, if a physician's account differed, if rumors spread, the consequences could be severe: public scandal, accusations of infidelity, litigation, or even economic loss. Equally, the evidence shows variability. Some households may have used purely symbolic acts, others might have resorted to rigorous medical testimony in the face of dispute. Beyond the immediate family, the ritual reveals broader truths about Roman society. Law shaped bodies. Legal concerns about heirs, property, and bloodlines did not remain abstract. They reached into bedrooms, rituals, and medical practice. The juridical desire for certainty translated into procedures that, to modern sensibilities, feel invasive. Yet to contemporaries, such measures could be rationalized as necessary to preserve household continuity. The everyday normalization of invasive procedures, the banality of brutality, is one of the most unsettling lessons of this history. When institutions demand proof, the human body becomes a site of verification. As we follow the arc of this practice historically, we see gradual transformation. Over centuries, with changing legal frameworks and moral norms, the explicit reliance on such rituals waned. Christianized legal thought emphasized different forms of marriage validation, sacramental and moral, rather than ritualized domestic proof. The pronaba's role changed. Some household emblems disappeared or were repurposed. Certain rites were suppressed. The physical artifacts that might testify to ritual practices were destroyed, recycled, or obscured. Textual traces that criticized pagan practices were preserved, but many neutral or practical records, lists of household customs, manuals kept within families, were lost. The result is a historical lacuna, a practice visible in fragments, vivid in polemic, but elusive in comprehensive documentation. It is important to underline the ethical dimensions of reconstructing this history.
We cannot recover the inner thoughts of the women involved. Their silence is itself a source to be interpreted. When we dramatize Livia's night, it is to make a human face on structural dynamics, not to imply that every woman lived the same story. Historical variability means that the ritual's forms and meanings shifted across time, space, and class.
For some brides, the night may have been little more than a brief symbolic gesture. For others, it could involve detailed examination and profound humiliation. The historian's task is to acknowledge this uncertainty while assembling a narrative that explains why such practices existed and how they were experienced. The final layer of this story is memory. Why was this custom hidden, and how was it nearly forgotten? Some of the answer lies in deliberate suppression. As Christian moral discourse condemned pagan sexual rites, the physical objects and textual references that attested to those rites were often targeted. Shrines were dismantled, votive objects smashed, and household records that might have contained neutral or technical descriptions failed to be copied by later scribes who prioritized theological works. Some practices, moreover, were reshaped into new forms or quietly abandoned as legal reforms and changing social attitudes made them obsolete. The lives of many women passed with these ceremonies as private, unrecorded events. Their experiences remained within households and rarely entered public archives. But the concealment was not only external, it was also social and gendered. The patriarchal structure of evidence in Rome meant that the state and the courts privileged male testimony, legal documentation, and the voices of authorities. Women's voices, especially those speaking from positions of vulnerability, rarely entered the written record. This structural silence means that the historian must read absence as evidence of power. Who gets to record, whose memories are preserved, and whose experiences are omitted, all tell a story about authority and erasure. Contemporary reflection complicates the picture further. Looking back, it is tempting to project modern values and to label ancient practices as barbaric or obscene. Yet responsible history refuses simple judgment, while still insisting on moral clarity. Institutional practices that reduce persons to instruments of legal proof deserve critical attention. The transformation from ritual to erasure, from performance to oblivion, raises urgent questions about how societies regulate bodies, how law defines personhood, and how memory is shaped by power. There is also a lesson about the historian's craft. The fragmented evidence surrounding Roman wedding night customs reminds us that the past is often a palimpsest. We read traces, compare accounts, weigh biases, and build narratives with care. When Augustine condemns a practice, his shame is informative, both about the practice itself and about how later readers perceived Rome. When Varro notes domestic customs, his description hints at long-standing patterns. When medical writers describe anatomy and signs, they give us a vocabulary for understanding what verification could mean. Together, these disparate witnesses allow us to reconstruct a plausible sequence: public rites followed by private verification, symbolic emblems used to represent consummation, medical testimony invoked in disputes, and a gradual cultural shift that erased or transformed the practice in the Christian era. As we close our account, return once more to the lived human stakes. For Livia the bride, the night might have cemented her legal status. It might have left her feeling exposed and silenced. Her life thereafter, motherhood, social duties, household management, would continue in the routines of Roman domesticity. Still, the mark of that night could linger, in whispered rumors, in the memory of a pronuba's grip, in the anxious deliberations of relatives during inheritance disputes. Across generations, such nights add up to a social structure in which bodies were sites of law. The silence of the women who lived through these practices is not accidental. It is a product of a system that privileged certain voices and destroyed or neglected others. Today, unearthing these hidden practices serves more than antiquarian curiosity. It prompts us to ask how legal regimes continue to shape intimacy, how cultural memory is curated and erased, and how historical silences reflect contemporary power. The sinister aspect of this wedding night custom is not only its invasive mechanics, but the normalizing logic that turned verification into routine and the erasure that followed. Remembering these histories is an act of justice toward those whose experiences were marginalized. If this uncovering of a human past moved you, write in the comments where you're watching from and which part of this history surprised you most. Share this video with someone who cares about the intersections of law, gender, and memory, and check the playlist for more episodes that dig beneath ancient facades to reveal the systems that shaped ordinary lives. In the end, the story is both specific and emblematic: a wooden emblem and a pronuba's hand, a physician's testimony and the quiet of a closed door, the bright pomp of a procession and the darker legal work that followed. These are the ingredients of a ritual that for some Romans decided whether a marriage would be recognized by law and history. It was hidden because it was private. It was nearly forgotten because its traces were scattered, censored, and dismissed. To recover it is to recover a small but revealing piece of how law reached into the most intimate corners of life, and how the voices of the vulnerable are too often lost when social systems seek certainty at their expense.